Please, can we have our seats? So, actually, words can express my feelings, and actually right now I feel very honored and actually serve to introduce to our conference and actually this session, Professor Richard Raguzzi. I will summarize and actually I will try to summarize as much as possible so we can start listening to the presentation with respect to the education. So it's a MSDP from University of Colorado, and then a PhD from Wayne State University, and then a PhD degree from Northwestern University, and MA from University of St. Thomas, with respect to honors, and actually it's University of Louisiana, Switzerland, 2001, University of Antwerp, Belgium, 2008, Norwegian School of Economics, Norway, 2011, and University of Cologne, Italy, 2013. When we talk about the employment, it's among the different universities, University of California, Berkeley, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, Stanford, and currently Michigan, University of Michigan. When we talk about members, being a member and actually on board of editors and reviewers for almost all consumer behavior and psychology and marketing research journals. When we talk about the publications, it's among the he received the Thomas Reuters recognition for ranking among the top 100% most cited in business and economics for the period 2002 to 2012. When we talk about the publications, it's actually in journals like more than, actually I stopped counting, Professor. It's more than 350 journals like Journal of Marketing, Journal of Marketing Research, Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science, Journal of Consumer Research, Journal of Psychology and Marketing. And finally, when we talk about books, it actually looks like causal modeling in marketing, marketing management, sales management. We are feeling very honored to have you and actually have you with us. Professor Richard Raguzzi talk today will be about biology, methods, neuroscience, and genetic foundations of marketing behavior, which show our appreciation for Professor Raguzzi.
Okay, thanks so much for coming. My hope is, I should have titled this differently. It's not just a foundation for marketing behavior, but also organization behavior, strategy, and other areas of business. I got into this research because I knew a person who had autism, and you'll see in a few minutes why autism matters. My hope is that you will see neuroscience and genetics as Well, I'm going to use today to introduce and kind of educate you in the background on the opportunities for neuroscience and genetics and business. I hope that that will help you read the literature. But also, you may be able to research these areas. I didn't have any background in neuroscience or genetics, neither did my co-authors. As someone as old as I can work in this area, you can work and do a better job than I have. Now, I mentioned that I got into the research because I knew a person who had autism. But another reason to think about neuroscience and genetics is that it can give a researcher competitive advantage. So in this world championship for sailing here, all of these sailors have the same currents in the ocean, the same winds, but one of those boats is going to win because of the people on the boat, and people working together and cooperating. And I think with neuroscience and genetics, it can help all of us not only to understand the literature, but to gain a competitive advantage in terms of publishing. Okay, I'm going to try to I'm going to start off and, with some background, but then I'll go into some neuroscience research. I'm going to cover 3 studies, 3 articles that I've done in that area, neuroscience with functional magnetic resonance imagery. And then I'll turn to some genetic work where genes with respect to neurotransmitters is really related to neuroscience. I'll cover a couple studies there as well. So it's not only with regard to marketing, but it's also with consumer behavior, managers in general, and different areas of business. So in a sense, we're going to study what goes on in this person's brain or the mind, is what I'll call it. Now, yesterday I was in the Egyptian Museum, and the guide was a fantastic tour guide. Mentioned briefly about the medical practice that went on starting 5,000 years ago, and Egyptian doctors from injuries that happened to workers or battles that were fought, from those external injuries to the brain. Over time, doctors slowly learned from those injuries which parts of the brain in different degrees affected different parts of our behavior. So over thousands of years, physicians in the beginning especially learned a lot about what goes on in our minds from these external injuries. There are also internal injuries like tumors and things of that sort that we've learned over time to coordinate what goes on in the brain. And then the things that I'm going to present show experiments. So I'll be looking at showing you experiments, how we can manipulate information, pictures that we see, and then from the coordination or correlation of those things in our mind through those experiments, we can figure what goes on. So let me give you some background. In the 1830s in France, there was a physician, medical doctor called Broca. Broca had a patient that wasn't able to speak and enunciate. He could make some sounds, but he wasn't able to speak at all. Otherwise, he was had normal intelligence. When Broca's patient died, they did an autopsy on him, and this is Broca's brain, his patient's brain. And you can see on this is the left side of the brain, so we're looking at the left side, and you can see right in this area here, there's a hole in the brain. And this patient had a lesion, a tumor there, and that area is connected to our speech, our lips, our tongue, our enunciation of words, and that area is now called Broca's area after the physician who found it. Now this is important because you'll see later when I talk about mirror neurons. Neurons are these nerves in our brain, and Broca's area comes back to inform that, as I'll make clear later. So this is the left side of the brain again, and I've chosen a diagram that shows I'll read these words here because they're small. But if you look over here where that hole in the brain of the patient, the broken was, there's the tongue, lips, jaws, cheekbones, all the way up to the arm, our thigh, our foot, and our toes. This is in the motor cortex area and the premotor cortex area. And on the left side of the brain, each of those little areas that I've shown here on the side of our brain controls the movement on our right side of the brain. And likewise, on the right side of the brain controls our left side. So the speech areas are largely functioning here, and that's what was damaged, and that's why the patient couldn't speak. There's another area of the brain about over here called Merritt's area that's also involved with speech, auditory. I got a message on the screen here. Something probably should be done, otherwise it might disappear. It just popped up. Okay, now that was in the 1830s in France. This is in the 1830s in the United States. This man seated there with that steel rod in his hands, his name was Phineas Gage. And Phineas Gage was a supervisor or manager on the railroad in New Hampshire and Vermont. They were building railroads through the mountains. And in order to clear away places with the tracks, they were using dynamite. So they would put dynamite into the ground. They would drill a hole into the ground that was about 5 or 6 centimeters in diameter. And they would put dynamite down there, and they would use a metal pole like this to pound the dynamite down. He was a supervisor, so he was inspecting those holes with the metal pole, and the dynamite prematurely fired. And that this rod here went through the bottom of his jaw and out the top of his skull. And here's a recreation of that. This is the injury that he received from that blowing up of the dynamite. He never lost consciousness. They had a horse cart that took him to a doctor, treated him, and he physically fully recovered. And he tried to go back to work as a manager, but he had trouble controlling his personality. Before that, he was a good family man, a good manager, a good person overall. But when he was working with people now, after that injury, he would get extremely angry, lose his patience, he would attack people. And then we coordinated that where that went through his brain. Here, it goes through what's called the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, and it's connected with our planning, self-control, and other kind of thinking processes, cognitive processes. So we learned from these physical injuries what part of the brain is connected to what part of thinking. So here's a diagram I put up just to show some of this. This is the left side of our brain again. The front part on the left is called the prefrontal cortex. And you can see here, this is an area of planning, emotion, judgment. And that's what this Phineas Gage lost by that injury. His emotional behavior, he wasn't able to control it anymore. Here's the speech area again, Broca's area. The voluntary movement is in this area of the brain. Sensation in this area. Here's Bennington's speech area. All our visual processing occurs in the back, and some of our hearing goes on here as well. This is just some of the subsets and things that we've learned over time by injuries or things, diseases that have gone on in the brain. Here's another one showing the left side of the brain and the front side. And here's this ventral medial prefrontal cortex, where that iron bar went to Phineas Gage's brain. And the orbitofrontal cortex is another. So our thinking processes, our cognitive, rational, our short-term memory go on in the front part of the brain, in the middle and below. A lot of our emotions are processed, but there's interconnections amongst all of the regions of the brain. In our brains are these neurons. There are billions of these neurons, and they're all connected with each other. There's always a nucleus, but these terminals here, the axon terminals, are connected to dendrites of other neurons with the chemical electrical processes that communicating with each other. They're firing, they're activated in our brains. And the way that I've been studying managers and consumers is using functional magnetic resonance imagery machines. So the manager lays down here and they're brought into the machine. They're either listening to stimuli that I prepared, experimental stimuli, or we have a bunch of mirrors that they can see videos. And the experiments I'm going to talk about have used both of those methods. So we have to test each patient or each manager or each consumer one at a time. Okay, the first study I want to talk about is called, it deals with the theory of mind. The theory of mind came out of this autism research. And I started reading in autism to understand this person who had autism. And I started with a book by Uta Frith, who was a British neuroscientist, her and her husband in England have done pioneering work with autism. Now, when you think about autism or mental retardation and things like that, we often think of them in categories. You're either autistic or you're not. But it's better to think about autism and most other mental maladies as a matter of degree, as a continuum. And at one end of the extreme is the observable extreme autism, and at the other end are people that don't seem to exhibit autism. Autism is a communicative disorder that involves not being able to infer the thoughts or beliefs or feelings or volitions and intentions of other people when we interact with them. The person who has autism, that process is interfered with. So this is the definition of autism. Yeah. I got this example from the first book to talk about theory of mind, the first published book, and it illustrates what's going on when we speak about theory of mind processes and inferences. So this fellow at the left here, Jack, he has a mental state. So this represents something he's thinking about. You know, maybe he's thinking about the lunch he's going to have an hour from now. Something he wants to eat, something he desires. So anyway, he has a mental thought process. A friend of his, a close friend, so they've interacted a lot, they know each other pretty well. And she, by watching him or in his body, his posture, and other gestures and so on, she can make an inference about Jack and what he might be thinking about. That's the first order kind of mind reading, or it's also called mentalizing or theory of mind. And Jack is observing her, observing him, and he's thinking that she's thinking that he's thinking about something like lunch. Maybe that's one stage too far, but mentalizing, or as this is called, a theory of mind, involves that. We all do that all the time. It's an automatic process. We learn over time, subconsciously through developmental processes in the family, for example. What another person might be thinking or feeling. It's a skill that we developed. A person with autism, though, that skill is impaired. And this is I want to illustrate the effect of mentalizing or autism with this painting. This painting was done by Latour, who was a French painter. The painting was done about 1630. He was from the Lorraine area of France, that was near the German border. And this is the Baroque period, and so most paintings had moral themes to them at the time. Let's take a look at the painting, and I'll point out a few things before I make my main point. I guess the person at the left is the youngest person in the figure. He has more money on the table here. They're all playing this card game, gambling, and he's more opulent dressed, so he's richer, young person. He's looking at his cards here, and with his eyes down a little bit, so he's a little pensive, thinking about maybe what to play, what cards to play. And then in the middle of the picture is this woman, and by her eyes, maybe her hand, pointing to her right, she's obviously connected in some way to this guy. But this guy, who has cards in his right hand, behind his back, felt he was cheating. So in some way, maybe she and he worked together to cheat him of his money. And the student here probably has seen this many times, and so she has sort of a wise look to her. She knows what's going on. It probably doesn't approve of it, I would imagine. So this painting, like many other famous paintings, is telling a story. And all of us can look at paintings and figure out a part of that story. But when this painting was shown to a patient, a woman about 26 years old who had, at the time it was called Asperger's disease, but that now is called high-functioning autism. So that if you or I were to meet her on the street, we would perceive her for what she was, as a very intelligent woman, and appeared to be normal, except for the damage that was done in some way early in her life to parts of her brain. So this painting was shown to her, and she was asked to write down all the things that she thought about or felt as she looked at the painting. And she took approximately an hour to do it, so she had a lot of observations. She wrote down things about the colors, about the positions of people, the lighting, those kind of details. Actually, she was really good with phenomenal detail. But she said nothing about the story. In the pictures, I might have I made up a story there, but I think it's largely true. She had no words written down about that story. But then she was told something about the painting along maybe the lines that I observed about people playing cards and somebody trying to cheat somebody else, and they're working together to do that. And she looked at the researchers when she was told that, and she said, you people are crazy. You read into things that aren't there. And a person with autism has a hard time of understanding the interpersonal situation that goes on in a painting or a movie or interacting face-to-face with another person. And moreover, it creates a lot of anxiety because they know there's something going on there, and they know the other person sees something that they don't see. And it's really disturbing for the self-image, and anxiety levels go really high. Now, this was a person who was a high-functioning autism person, and people that are low-functioning, of course, have extreme difficulties in that way. Okay, what is interpersonal analyzing? Well, this is this activity of inferring another person's beliefs, desires, maybe their risk preferences, decisions, intentions, volitions, different emotional reactions, any kind of mental event or state that when we see somebody in a movie or interact with them, we're always doing this. Usually we're not conscious of it. It happens automatically. But we can become conscious of it too and develop it as a skill. That's interpersonal analyzing, or theory of mind. And it's associated with putting ourselves in the shoes of another person, as it's sometimes called, or taking the perspective of another person. So it's mentally stimulating maybe what another person thinks, wants, feels, likes, decides to do. Research done by neuroscientists have pinpointed actually 4 different regions of the brain. I'm showing 3 here. So this is the left side of the brain in, and then this section down the middle. And right here, maybe 2 centimeters in the front of our skull, is what's called the medial prefrontal cortex. A lot of our conscious thinking processes go on there. That's an important area that's been discovered and work with autistic, especially children, but also adults. And they're often compared in control groups with mentally retarded and so-called normal children to find differences. Medial prefrontal cortex. Then there's something called the temporal lobes area on the left side and the right side as well. It's not just at this point, but it covers different areas here and outside. And the temporal parietal junction, both on the left and right side. These are the areas that research at the time we did our study. This was a study that came out in the Journal of Marketing Research. Were identified by leading neuroscientists like Fritz, maybe and others. There was a while after we finished the first draft of our paper, I came across another study that identified a fourth area called the precuneus region. That region is about here, it's the back of the brain near the top. The precuneus region is it has an executive function of separating us from other people that we interact with. Not realizing that we are interacting with another person, that we're not overlapping with them, for example. That process also goes on the medial prefrontal cortex as well. So this is what the research showed in the neuroscience area. We were aware of that. Now what we want to do is we want to put managers into functional magnetic resonance imaging machines. We want to stimulate their mentalizing processes, and we want to correlate it with a scale that we developed called the sales theory of mind scale. And so what we do is we do these functional magnetic imaging studies. How do they identify which patterns of the brain activities are associated with these cognitive processes dealing with autism-like behaviors? Now, at the time, I mentioned I was stimulated by interactions with a person with autism. And if you've ever dealt with people with autism, it's really hard to communicate with them. There are many heartbreaking situations that come about. These are the cognitive processes that I want to study, but they're not just processes that are a small percentage of the population, but we all have those same brain areas that I pointed to a minute ago, and those areas are better or worse working for each of us on a continuum, going from maybe no autism to high autism, somewhere in between. So it was a big gamble for us because we were assuming that if we looked at managers, we could place them somewhere on that continuum, and we have enough variation that we would be able to find the associations that we hope to find. So how did we do that? Well, it's done by comparing activity during the performance of two tasks. We actually have three tasks, an experimental task and two controls. Those tasks are identical in every way except for one, the presence of the cognitive processes of interest in the experimental task, which is what we're studying, and then the absence of that process in the comparison task. These are the experimental tasks. There were three kinds of stories. The first story had this mental state attribution, this theory of the mind mentalizing condition. So people heard 5 different scenarios, 5 different stories, vignettes. Each of those lasted about 38 seconds, and everybody was listening to them. And the first time we ran it, they were reading it on paper, but they moved their heads so much and messed up the data. We learned the hard way and throw that data away and start all over. So we used auditory procedures for it. They heard 5 stories for 38 seconds. I'm going to give you an example in 1 minute. Right? They also heard 5 stories that involved attributions, that is, inferences that they make automatically, but it didn't involve mentalizing. It didn't involve inferring the beliefs or feelings of another person. And then another control condition was the one at the bottom. So they heard 5 of those. Each sentence was unrelated to the next sentence. When you read all of the sentences in 30-some seconds, or hear all of them for 30-some seconds, they sound silly, but they have no mental inference processes going on. So I want to give you an example of one of those 15 stories that everybody heard from the first category, the mentalizing category. So this is scenario number 2 of 5. Let's read it together. Before visiting a customer, Jacqueline always browses the customer's website. While browsing one of these websites, she notices that the director, who she has known for a long time, still works for the firm in question, but she also notices that many people have joined the firm. Jacqueline is especially curious about what these new people think of her firm. However, Jacqueline first decides to speak with the director, the person she's known for a long time. Therefore, she calls him to suggest having dinner together. Then after they heard the stories, there was a second or two pause, and then they heard another question. Why did Jacqueline ask the director to have dinner with her? While people are listening to these stories, they're laying down in the functional magnetic resonance energy machine. The machine is magnetic, it's picking up the magnetism basically in the blood flow in the brain. And there are many, many tens of thousands of measurements going on slowly as the brain scans, as the machine scans their brain as they're listening to those stories. Now, that's what we stimulate through these experimental manipulations, but we want to associate it with subjective states that the managers experience. So we developed a scale. We went to the literature on communication, went to the literature on sales management, and the literature in neuroscience, and generated many, many items to measure the aspects of communication. We developed questions for those items. We gave it to samples of people, and then we factor analyzed those, and we came up with what we call the sales theory of mind scale, which had about 14 items. There were 4 factors. I want to briefly define the factors for you and give you an example question each time. So the first factor we call building rapport. So the salesperson builds rapport with the customer. We define that as the ability to take initiative in sales conversations and to build rapport in those conversations. There are 3 items. Here's an example. So people had this item, they had to respond to it as a matter of degree of how well it applied to them personally, not at all, moderately, very much. I think a 7-point scale, maybe 5 or 7, I forgot. So when I'm with a customer, for example, in the elevator before a sales meeting, I can easily kindle a small conversation. So that's an example of factor 1. Factor 2, we called detecting nonverbal cues as part of communication when we interact with others. You know, whether their face, their hands, body, language, and so on. It's the ability to notice those subtle cues during sales conversations. And we have 4 items for that. An example item. At times I realize that I do not pick up hints in sales conversations. That means, in a sense, this was reverse coded. So the person's interacting with someone else, but they're a little bit aware that they're not following or able to judge what the other person might be thinking. So thus, after the meeting, the colleague that I'm interacting with explaining, or another associate explains to me what happened during the conversations. Only then do I realize what happened during the conversations. So there were 4 of those items. The third factor, it's not coming through well here, but it's basically taking a bird's eye view. It's related to thinking ironically or ironic thinking. So we define it as supplying missing information, achieving closure during sales conversations. And there were 4 items for that. Sometimes I summarize for customers what has been said up to that point in the meeting, and subsequently the conversation runs more smoothly. Then the last factor we call shaping the interaction, and it's the ability to influence our interactions with customers in a positive way. There's 3 items of that. I can easily make people feel more comfortable during the sales conversation. So these 14 or so items, after the person was in the machine, the fMRI machine, and we activated their mind in terms of making inferences, they answered these questions, and now we relate the degree of activation in different areas of the brain to how extreme they are in the sales theory of mind scale. So, and this is the result. So let me talk about it because at the bottom it's a little bit small. But this is another way of showing activation by the colors here. And we found that indeed the medial prefrontal cortex was activated strongly by this theory of mind versus control condition, as was the right and left temporal parietal junction. The temporal poles didn't work, just these 2 regions. Actually, the 4th region that I talked about before, that we discovered after actually paper was accepted, was this precunious region. And we put that, we were able to do a web appendix for our article, so it's in the web appendix. And what's plotted at the bottom on the x-axis is the extreme scale, the sales theory line scale from low to high. So the more they were attuned to this theory of mind processes, being able to make inferences of others' thoughts, for example, the higher the activation in that region of the brain. And the first region is the right temporal parietal junction. This region is the temporal cortex. This is the left temporal parietal junction. So as the scores on this subjective report of the questionnaire increase and go up, so does the activation of the regions here increase. So this was our way of proving that, in this case, managers are able to make inferences of other people. And then we were also, an additional kind of benefit of this methodology is that it's a way of validating scales, psychological scales, that has both of these elements to it. In all our studies, I probably should mention first that most neuroscientists do the manipulation and then measure the brain activity, but they often stop there. They don't link brain activity to the subjective responses and feelings and thoughts of the person that they're being measured. So we're doing that explicitly here. When we go another step farther in all our studies, so I want to give you an example that besides doing the study in the laboratory, we do a field study with a real sales force, and we take the subjective scale that we use and we relate it to this case performance. So here's a summary of the results of one of the studies. We also did what's called a multi-method matrix to look at the construct validity of the measures in 2 different samples. Here, this is a summary of these ellipses are really factors, they're latent variables, and this system of latent variables is actually a simultaneous equation system using what's called structure equation models. And our main dependent variable is the performance. This was a sales force of maybe 150 managers, and we measured their performance. The proximal determinants of their performance were scales from famous studies done in the area. So Bart White's did scales, studying on adaptiveness, ability to stand on one's feet, to think on one's feet. So we measured that, the ability to take the perspective of another person, and social anxiety. As I mentioned, anxiety is really important with autism. And then this part of the model here is farther away to represent what goes on deep in our brain. And it's these 4 dimensions of theory of mind. 3 of those dimensions loaded, these are factors again, they loaded on a second order factor. It's just a more abstract representation of those 3. And then the 4th factor is by itself. And what we found was the numbers, which you can't read, I think they're too small, but there are 2 sets of numbers on each line or arrow. The one not in parentheses was for one sample of salespeople, the one in parentheses was for a second sample, so we did a kind of validation. And the main finding was this rapport building, sales theory 9 alignment rapport building. The greater a person scores on being able to build rapport when they interact with others, the less anxiety they felt. The less anxiety they felt, the higher their performance was. So it's a kind of validation of that, of the theory of mind is applied to this extension of autism normal, so-called normal people. And then the other 3 dimensions have a direct path to both samples to performance. Adaptiveness perspective taking these famous scales are not significantly related to performance. So the most important thing was the scale. So that was our external validity test. Okay, so that was study 1. The next study I want to talk about is not dealing with thinking processes, cognitive processes, but it's dealing with kind of feeling processes. And speaking figuratively, you might think of empathy as a kind of communication going on between two people, brain to brain. But of course, it doesn't happen through our skulls electronically. It happens through our perceptions, through the eyes and sounds of another person that empathy is processed. So what is empathy? Well, psychologists define it as a compound mental state that has different parts to it. It has thinking parts, cognitive parts, it has feeling parts, and emotional parts. Eisenberg did a review in the annual review of psychology, and if you want a psychologist's point of view, that's a good summary of it. The first dimension, first component, is this cognitive capacity to take the perspective of another person, often expressed in many languages as putting yourself in the shoes of another person. It's a thinking process largely. The second dimension is this emotional reaction to the feelings of others. When we feel compassion or pity, but especially compassion, or have empathetic concern for another person, we're experiencing the emotional aspect of empathy. There's another component, and I touched on it when I talked about the precuneus process in the last study. It's called a monitoring mechanism that registers the source of the experienced affect, but in a way differentiating ourselves from other people. Sometimes when we see, for example, another person suffering, really suffering, and we can be so upset by that and ourselves, and that in a sense it becomes more about our own emotions, not the emotions of the person who's suffering. But empathy is supposed to be about the other person, caring for the other person, feeling compassion for the other person. But if that separation doesn't occur, when we can't feel that, we're in essence become the other person, and the other person becomes us, and it's another kind of mental state, not empathy. Some famous actors and actresses in certain famous movies that I don't have time to talk about, but I came across, had nervous breakdowns at the end of intense interactions because they became the character and lost the sense of who they were, and the suffering of the other person was so overwhelming that they sometimes lost consciousness. So this is the psychological definition of empathy. It has these three components, main components. There's some other components that are more minor, but these are the important ones. And Massetti is a famous neuroscientist at the University of Chicago. He's a Frenchman that's done a lot of pioneering work on empathy. So how do we study empathy? In Parma, the University of Parma, Italy, there's a famous researcher named Rizzolatti. He was studying brain processes, and they were using monkeys. I showed you the functional magnetic resonance imagery for the autism study, but functional magnetic resonance imagery looks at regions of the brain. Now, they're relatively small regions, but in each region are many thousands of neurons firing. Each neuron are nerves. Rizzolatti and his associates wanted to study the firing and the activation of single neurons. And to do that, you have to implant in the brain electrodes, which is normally not ethical with humans, with people. There's a special case that I won't go into now where that's possible. So Rizzolatti and his associates were studying what was going on in the brain of monkeys. So they had the electrodes in the brain of the monkey. The electrodes were hooked up to speakers on the walls, and every time the part of the brain where the electrode was in, the monkey fired, was activated, you could hear it firing. Now, there's an apocalyptic story about one of Rizzolatti's colleagues, students. His name was Lacey. And Lacey was in the laboratory working with the monkey, and the monkey was watching him, and he had his back turned to the monkey. And Rizzolatti was working on equipment. That's one way I heard the story. And as he was working on the equipment, he heard the speakers fire. And so he knew that there was some activation going on in the monkey. Normally, they place these electrodes in the monkey's motor area, the part of the brain that sends signals to our muscles, such that when we move like our arms, the electric signal would go on and you could hear it. He turned around and saw the monkey sitting passively there, just like this monkey. And he noticed that the monkey's brain was firing. He didn't know why. And they figured out that every time the monkey would see an action of another monkey, or in this case a person, move, that same region of the brain of the monkey would be activated as the person that they were observing. So they came to call these mirror neurons, like looking in the mirror, reflecting back at you. So I put a little summary here. So in normal conditions, the monkey, in this case holding a banana, the monkey moves his arm. And when he moves his arm, this part of in us it's called the premotor motor cortex, but has a different name for monkeys. But it's nevertheless connected to their muscle movements. So they move their arm, this little area activates. If they move their leg, there's another little area above it that activates. But that's the same, by accident, Rizzolatti discovered, as what happens when the monkey watches, in this case, the researcher, move his arm. The same area gets activated. So I think you can imagine, by watching others do things and things happening to them, if those same regions in our brain get activated, if they're feeling, say, suffering or pain, we can feel that suffering and pain as well. And it's automatic. Here's a summary of where some of the major areas of the brain where these mirror neurons go on. Here's that premotor or motor cortex area, the inferior parietal lobe. It also happens in the occipital lobe, the superior temporal sulcus area, left and right. And then this area especially, they call it the inferior frontal gyrus, but there are different traditions, different names. I know it as the pars opercularis, but that was that Broca's area that was activated. Okay, the same area. These are where the mirror neurons become activated. Okay. That's the process in brain. We relate those processes to what goes on subjectively. To do that, we measure with a scale. The sales orientation, speaking figuratively, it says, how can I convince the customer to buy our product? Actually, a sales orientation is from the point of view of the seller. And sometimes the sellers use deception or guile or manipulation, and they're trying to satisfy their needs, the seller's needs, not the customer's needs. So we also measure customer orientation. Each of these are measured with 5 items. We measure customer orientation, and speaking metaphorically again, what is in the best interest of the customer, and how can I best respond to those interests? So in a sense, I start with the needs of the customer. I try to adjust my product or service to meet the needs of the customer, and I adjust the way I speak to him or her to meet those needs. That's the customer orientation. It's a much more empathetic process. The other process is more one-way. So we study those processes. Here's an example of the scales. I'm just going to read one item. The 5th item on the bottom says, I try to figure out what the customer's needs are. Here's how we stimulated the empathy, mirror neurons. There were 5 men and 5 women. There were video clips. Each of the 5 men and each woman posed in a neutral face video. And in fact, they always started out neutral. And then they did faces that expressed happiness, surprise, anger, and disgust. And then we had a control condition, a neutral condition, and then had another control condition, moving geometric shapes. Each of the video clips was played for 3 seconds in 12-second blocks. So there were 3 video clips with a second in between, and they were all randomized and counterbalanced. So here's an example, a still photo, but these were video clips. And so this was 3 neutral faces. And 3 seconds, second, 3 seconds, second, in between 3 seconds. but then they saw surprised faces, happy faces, angry faces, disgusted faces, neutral like here, and then moving geometric shapes. This shows the left side of the brain, but this is not actual pictures. This is just a diagram to show which areas were activated. Here's the pars orbicularis or Broca's area. The motor areas are shown here at the top. There's an area in the temporal poles called the fusiform gyrus, and a couple areas. This is on the surface of the brain. This is inside the brain. A couple of those areas were activated. And what we found was, and I'm going to read this because it's small, but we found that 4 regions of the brain associated with mirror neurons, the activation of those regions as measured with the functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, versus the machine, were correlated 0.55 with one region, 0.72 with another, 6.7, third, 7.2. So indeed, the perception of the emotions of others is inducing this response of us of empathy, emotional. We also did a field study, I'm just going to show the results of that with a large sales force, where we measured as dependent variables what's called building rapport with customers, or building relationships with customers in 3 areas there. We related customer orientation and sales orientation, empathy, and maybe the opposite of empathy, and found out that for these salespeople, their empathy or customer orientation is the key positive relationships with buying centers and so on. I want to do as much as I can in this third study. So let me show you 8 minutes left. It's getting lower now. Okay. Third study was putting together 2. Third study appeared in the management journal, the journal of management, and we wanted to study empathy and theory of mind together and show in some ways it's a boundary condition of self-interest or Machiavellianism. There was a movie done by Jack Nicholson in the US in 1998, I think it came out. It was called, I forgot what it was called, The Shining. Yeah, thank you. And he played a great psychopath. And Machiavellianism, Niccolo Machiavelli was a practitioner and writer in politics in the 1400s in Firenze, in Italy. And now, because it's so similar to what's called psychopathy, people are studying, especially psychologists and organizational behavior people, are studying Machiavellianism. What is Machiavellianism? It's the personality, style, or trait characterized by social conduct that involves taking advantage of others for personal gain. It's contrasted with benevolent or cooperative actions, and it plays a central role in politics, business, of course, legal matters, as well as everyday behavior. Some characteristics of Machiavellians, they have a dismal outlook on life and the nature of other people. People are cynical. They have an orientation that's called opportunism. They have a saying that they precept that they have that strike first before other people take advantage of you. In more crude language, Machiavellians will say, screw them before they screw you. This is their attitude. They use deceit and guile, flattery, manipulation. They manipulate others for their personal gain. That's the Machiavellian. They tend not to feel guilt, shame, or embarrassment much. They exhibit what other people would call cool syndrome. They appear to be cool and calm, collected persons. They're not distressed by others' suffering. So you can see that maybe they don't have empathy. They're not committed to individuals, groups, or ideas. So they're not the best people to have as a part of a team working in an organization with other people. Okay. Research to date has been experimental or survey-based using questionnaires, not fMRI. So we're one of the first to look at that. We use the Mach 4 scale as our subjective measure. So we measure what goes on in the brain, but we also measure their subjective experience. But the research up to this point is very contradictory, and what we're trying to study is, are Machiavellians, are they more empathetic and they need to be, more manipulative? Can they put themselves in the shoes of other people or not? That's a bit of a summarizing. And I'm going to summarize now the results. We did 2 studies now, 2 different studies. One to study theory of mind and cognitive processes, and one to study the emotional and empathy processes. So this is the theory of mind, and what we found with theory of mind was that all of the regions of theory of mind which are listed here, correlations with their Machiavellianism are listed here. And what we found is that people who are high in Machiavellianism are less able to put themselves in the shoes of others. People who are not Machiavellian, more normal, are able to put themselves in the shoes of others. Contrary to what people have speculated in research but never tested. And then the next study we did was to look at the regions of the brain that are associated with mirror neurons, and found that there was positive association with mirror neurons. This negative number here is with the preclusion, so it should be negative because that's the theory of mind that was on our manipulation checks. So people who are Machiavellian and manipulate others in an automatic sense are actually able to resonate to the emotions of others and the feelings of others better than people who are not Machiavellian. Which means, and this is in a non-conscious way now, and this means that a salesperson sitting across from a customer might be able to sense better if they're Machiavellian than a non-Machiavellian, whether the customer is resisting their product, whether the customer feels that some attribute or characteristic of their product is something that they don't benefit from or don't want, and that's what we found. This was the first study in our knowledge ever anywhere, so neuroscience, psychology, or business, to find that defining qualities of empathy, as psychologists define empathy to be a priori, actually can be disassociated and go in opposite directions, so that the feeling part of empathy and the thinking part of empathy don't necessarily go together. At least for Machiavellians, they actually are opposite reactions. How much time do I have? I didn't have to say. 1 minute. We also did a field study, but I'm not going to show you the results of that. And maybe I'll end it with this fellow is sitting on his couch, and his partner walks in, and he says, I got my DNA. He had his DNA analyzed by his saliva. And he said, guess what? I'm a top school. He's taking a lot of pride in that. So his DNA, it says that he's descended from the Habsburgs, Central Europe. And I won't be able to tell about this study, but we studied the role of genes and genetic mechanisms of management in business, but also with consumers. And maybe I'll end up with the consumer diagram because I think it's really interesting. I can get through here in a hurry. Sorry. Oops, that's it. We studied consumers playing a game called the sympathy game. And economists, and I'm going to end it with this. The economists look at what they call cooperation or trust, competitive games against each other, and they try to predict what people do. So we use the same dependent variable they did, in fact, use their same games. Economists predict in the game a person has a chance to trust people by passing, or they take the money. They pass, they get a bigger pot. Next time one takes money, they get more money, or if they pass, it grows more and more. So it's better and better to cooperate. But economic theory says it's always better to take it. That's the self-interest motive. They find that not everybody is highly self-interested. Many people trust others and are cooperative. So we were trying to understand the mechanism behind that. We measure people's genes genes having to do with affiliation and attachment and love. We measure attachment styles as a psychological variable. We also use an environmental variable where half the people were touched on the shoulder to stimulate kind of empathetic-like responses. And we found that the interaction, the statistical interaction between psychological attachment styles or the environmental variable of being touched with a specific gene variant. These genes usually have 3 variants, and you or I would have one of those 3. And if we had that one variant, not the other 2, so maybe a third of us, 30%, that possession of that allele or polymorphism would interact with the attachment styles, which are 3, secure, anxious, avoidant, to influence empathy. So only under those conditions, when your psychological variable or environmental variable interact with one of these 3 polymorphisms, would that lead to empathy, both perspective taking and empathetic concern, the emotional part. That would lead to trust, and then trust would lead to cooperation. And it was actually fully mediated, so this was not significant, this is not significant, and actually this was not significant as well. But they're all tested together in a model called multiple regression model. It's a macro and free macro, for example, an SPSS process model. And so genetic variables interact with psychological variables. I didn't show you, but with the sales managers, the environmental variable was stress. So role conflict of stress interacted with psychological attachment styles, interacted with a particular gene variant. Those 3 things together influence motivation, effort put forth, influence job satisfaction, and those 2 in turn led to greater performance, to the performance of 5 tasks. That's all I'm going to present. I don't know if we have time for questions. No. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Richard. Actually, you started by some extent looking that there is no, and please, looking that there is no direct relationship or correlation between actually age and research. And actually, after your presentation, I felt very bold, very bold. So we will leave the floor actually for question.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much, Professor Richard. It was a very breakthrough action. I have 2 comments. One personal, if the chairs allow me, then I have a question for you. First of all, I have known Professor Richard only through emails. I'm supervising a PhD thesis with him and Professor Wael. Professor Richard is a very well-known marketing scholar, and we all know this. However, he's a very humble, nice, supportive, helpful, very much down to the earth person. He's helping everybody. He's helping his students. He's treating them like his own daughters and sons. You can even actually feel this through just emails going back and forth with him. I guess this is my belief. I guess the more you know, the more you become humble. It's not the other way around. Thank you very much. I hope we will have a lifetime friendship and professional relationship with you, Professor. Thank you very much. Well,
Thank you.
You have authored a book about science of marketing, or is marketing a science? You have lots of insights about is marketing a science. I'm also teaching advanced marketing course to PhD students in one stream. The first topic we've discussed is marketing a science. Today, what you were saying, what you were telling us, what you have been using is real science, is hard science. So this research results, is it, of course, it should be generalized. It doesn't have like a cultural differences. So can you please tell us, are we now approaching saying that marketing is a science? Are we using science now in marketing? If this is generalizable, are we using the methodologies now to say that our results are generalizable? Thank you very much.
This question of is marketing a science was a big one in the 1970s. My teachers discussed that often and had us discuss it as students. But after that, since 1970s, marketing departments in the United States, students and professors have not been discussing that topic anymore. So I haven't been thinking about it much either. But I come from with regard to this issue, from a liberal arts tradition, where science and liberal arts, history, and political science, and sociology, and other qualitative areas are merged with science. And I haven't thought of it for a long time, but when I think about the painting I put up there, and our philosophy of measuring subjective states, the actual states of people, because neuroscientists claim that all mental states and events, any thought or feeling that we have, they believe it can be reduced down to the chemicals and the atoms, the physical processes going on. Nearly every neuroscientist believes that. There are more than 160,000 neuroscientists around the world. My co-author and I have an article coming out in Organization Research Methods later this year, where we talk about human consciousness and give history of it from a philosophical point of view. And these conscious processes, subjectivity, how things feel to us, what our subjective reactions are as important as all this scientific measurement with the physiological processes that we use. We really have to find a way to bring them together, marry them together. So I don't see it as just a scientific process, I see it as an interpretive understanding process, not just testing explanation and predictions, but showing the link between the physical things that go on in our heart and brain and the feelings and thoughts that we have in a qualitative way. I think it has to be both to be successful. But there's this tension because the neuroscientists don't believe in that at all. They're very critical of this kind of approach. On the other hand, there are many thoughtful philosophers who say that you can't separate this subjectivity from the science of the life. That's the meaning. And I've been thinking about that a lot in this last year, and thank goodness that we have built in this subjective part into all our studies. It was more by accident than design. So I don't think the marketing or business will only be a science, but I think two viewpoints, more mathematical, more analytical, more optimization, more use of high-power statistics. Our curriculum now, we're having special data, analytic big data, we're having programs in marketing science or and analysis. It seems like we're going maybe we're pushing out the subjectivity. We need both of them at the same time. We can't have a course in subjectivity and a course in analytics. People that really integrate into science. So my hope is that there will be this science and liberal art point of view will come through eventually. It's not easy talking about it with colleagues, though.
I'm sorry, I have to say something very quickly. First, of course, I can't agree more. I always agree with that, but I can't agree more with what you said. I was struck actually by the strong, wonderful modesty of religion. And actually, my neuroscience activations are not working very well. I work with the leader to express my feelings as a marketing researcher, sitting down on the researcher slide, and we come to, as I said on my Facebook poll a few days ago. The point is, when I first thought of the PhD was Reed, who we are so lucky to have a PhD today, by far, was looking at as the extended examiner, Professor Proceeded was also supposed to come, and Professor Rishon was also Dr. Amir. By the way, today is the day I had my defense 20 years ago, and I always thought I was so afraid that I was pushing her into one of my semantic journals and experimentations. But when I looked at your work, and you, as I told you just before the session, I was so amazed that you accepted that. It's so important that we are pushing for so many goals by works like this. You do mention about universality, there was something with Dr. Amir and myself today on what we call the emotional smart research, being able to produce universal, transcending, and eternal market knowledge. It's a very foundational dream, we'll never be able to make it, but pushing in that direction, I think is very useful for marketing practitioners, not only marketing sales like us. And I still remember your code, and I always use it so many places. In your very early work in marketing stage, when you said we're not anymore dealing with artificially split disciplines, we are dealing with multi-dimensional problems. And the third wonderful thing is that when you talk about the distance between us and the customers and having that perspective, it looks very easy to say, but it's very difficult because we are not raised and created to look from our perspective. We are getting to look from our own perspective. And the always been questioning the way we measure by either questioning, observation, or secondary data. And I guess the depth and the breadth of marketing knowledge and insights and given marketing more scientific credentials, bridging the gap between marketing theory and practice is very, very insightful and substantial to be able to only do this. So actually, the neuroscience was, and I came through it because I was very much interested in artificial intelligence, and then I knew how it works and how to work with incomplete information. I guess this has achieved a very important dimension of marketing science. And though it's not a new question, but it provides a new answer to that long-standing question. So I guess you are coming more and more to make dreams come true through your research work, and hopefully we'll work with that with you as much as possible. We are pushing for a great goal of making marketing more of a human science, empathetic science. I may use your words, and this is very important. Just one question, because you have taken us into a whole new universe, a whole new world. How do you envisage the way forward? Very how do you envisage the way forward with this kind of research? Where should we go?
Well, I think we need to go into multi-level research, multi-perspectives, coordinate or overlap, self-validate each other.
So I see the neuroscience and genetics, which I wasn't able to speak about much, as complementing all the methods we have now. They're never going to replace them, like some neuroscientists believe. But I think it's where we go now is to be able to develop the skills to use multiple methods. Where these might be one, but depends on the problem. You know, some problems this may not fit. But these are going to be part of the future. We all have to be able to read these things in the future.
And it's very better thing that we remember to be able to take address on that goal. Like we talk about methodology, philosophy, is also very hard with science. So I guess this is a very way of bringing that synergy that was far from imaginable. Okay, thank you.
Well, God willing, yeah.
Thank you, Professor, and you very well. And actually, to have you, and actually, we are lucky enough that Professor is staying with us today. So, if anyone is interested, actually, we have a chat with Professor Richard because we are lagging behind our schedule and everything. So, thank you very much, and please let's show our teacher.
No.